May 21, 2016. Two people walking through a field on the outskirts of Green Bay, Wisconsin, spotted something that made them stop in their tracks. A woman's body lay in the grass. No clothes, no identification. Nothing to reveal who she was. Only a pair of socks remained on her feet, and a pink paper wristband was still wrapped around her wrist. At the same time, just a few miles away, a homeowner mowing his lawn discovered a thick cable lying beside the road. Dark brown stains covered part of it. When he looked closer, he noticed something even more disturbing. There appeared to be bloodstains on the pavement. Someone had clearly tried to wash them away. Whoever had been there the night before had worked very hard to hide what happened. But the strangest part of this case was yet to come. The investigation would eventually produce two seemingly perfect suspects. One had a clear motive. The other left DNA at the crime scene. And for a brief period of time, police arrested the wrong man. The victim was identified as Nicole Vanderheyden. She was 31 years old, a biology teacher, a mother of 3, and just 6 months earlier she had given birth to a baby boy. On the evening of May 20, 2016, Nicole attended a concert with her boyfriend, Doug Detry, and a group of friends. It should have been an ordinary night. After the concert ended, the group headed to a nearby bar. But once they arrived, tension began to build. Nicole started arguing with Doug through text messages. She believed he was avoiding her. The messages kept coming, and the accusations became increasingly heated. Around 12:20 a.m., Nicole stormed out of the bar. One of her friends tried to convince her to go home. She refused. It was the last time many people would ever see her alive. Not long afterward, Doug arrived at the bar and realized she was gone. He called her phone. The call connected, but all he heard were strange, unintelligible sounds. Then the call suddenly ended. Nicole's phone would never become active again. The next morning, she still hadn't returned home. Her friends had no idea where she was. Hospitals had no record of her. By that afternoon, Doug contacted police and reported her missing, but by then, investigators had already begun to suspect that Nicole was the woman found dead in the field earlier that morning. When detectives sat down with Doug, they weren't simply investigating a missing person case. They were investigating a homicide. And Doug quickly became their primary suspect. The reason was simple. He had argued with Nicole only hours before she disappeared. That's often where investigators begin. Then more troubling discoveries emerged. Dark stains were found inside Doug's garage. Blood was discovered in the trunk of his vehicle. Small blood spots were also located inside his bathroom. Everything seemed to point in the same direction. Then investigators uncovered what appeared to be the strongest evidence yet. A shoe print had been found on Nicole's body. When experts compared it to Doug's shoes, the tread pattern appeared remarkably similar. To detectives, it was a powerful clue. Blood, a matching shoe print, a recent argument, an angry boyfriend. Everything seemed to fit. Doug was arrested, and in the eyes of many people, the case appeared almost solved. But there was one problem. Every piece of evidence against him was about to fall apart. After Doug was taken into custody, investigators believed they were only a few laboratory tests away from closing the case. Everything seemed to be working against him. His girlfriend vanished after an argument. Blood had been found in his vehicle. The shoe print appeared to match, and now Doug was refusing to voluntarily provide a DNA sample to many observers. That looked like an admission of guilt, but investigators still needed science to confirm what they believed. The blood samples were sent to the lab. Every piece of evidence was carefully examined. Then the first results came back, and they were not what detectives expected. The blood in the trunk was human blood, but it didn't belong to Nicole. It belonged to her daughter. The child had suffered an injury in the vehicle months earlier. Investigators waited for another result. This time, they examined the dark stains found in the garage. Once again, the findings were surprising. It wasn't human blood. It was turkey blood left behind from a hunting trip. One piece of evidence disappeared, then another. The original theory began to unravel, but investigators still had one final hope: DNA. If Doug's DNA appeared on the murder weapon or the victim's clothing, the case would be over. Forensic analysts recovered a clear DNA profile from Nicole's sock and from the cable used during the attack. The results arrived. Detectives opened the report, and the room fell silent. The DNA didn't match. Not partially, not closely, not even remotely. It wasn't Doug. The person who touched the cable was someone else. The person who left DNA at the crime scene was another man entirely. In an instant, the entire case was turned upside down. The man police had believed was the killer for weeks might be completely innocent. After spending 18 days behind bars, Doug was released. But his release didn't provide answers. It only created a new question. If Doug wasn't the killer, then who murdered Nicole Vanderheyden? The investigation was nearly back at square one, and for weeks afterward, police found no meaningful leads, until an unexpected name appeared in the National DNA database. A name almost nobody recognized: George Birch. Doug's release didn't mean the case had been solved. It meant investigators had just lost their only suspect. After weeks of work, they were almost back to where they started. No eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage. No one had seen Nicole after she left the bar. All they had was an unidentified DNA profile. Investigators entered the DNA profile into the national database and waited. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing. The case began to stall for Nicola's family. It was terrifying. Every day without answers reduced the chances of finding her killer. Then, in August 2016, everything changed. A notification appeared. The National DNA database had found a match. Detectives immediately opened the file. The name attached to the DNA was George Birch. It wasn't the name they expected. George wasn't Nicole's boyfriend. He wasn't a friend. He wasn't a coworker. As far as anyone knew, he had no connection to Nicole whatsoever. At least not on the surface. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered something interesting. George Birch wasn't from Green Bay. He had moved there from Virginia only months before the murder. People described him as quiet, reserved, the kind of man who rarely attracted attention. But his history told a different story. Years earlier, George had been connected to a serious criminal investigation. Although he didn't spend years behind bars, his name had appeared in law enforcement records before. What fascinated detectives most was how his DNA ended up in the national database, not because of Nicola's murder, but because of an entirely different crime. After Nicole was killed, George became involved in a hit-and-run crash. According to investigators, he fled the scene, then allegedly set fire to the vehicle involved in an attempt to destroy evidence. When he was arrested, police collected his DNA as part of the standard process. George had no idea that decision would eventually come back to haunt him. Without that arrest, his DNA might never have been linked to Nicola's murder. Now investigators finally had a name, an address, a new suspect, and most importantly, a direct DNA connection to the crime scene. They prepared to question George Birch, but nobody in that interrogation room realized that George's biggest mistake wasn't his DNA. It was something he carried with him every single day: his cell phone. Doug's release didn't mean the case had been solved. It meant investigators had just lost their only suspect. After weeks of work, they were almost back to where they started. No eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage. No one had seen Nicole after she left the bar. All they had was an unidentified DNA profile. Investigators entered the DNA profile into the national database and waited. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing. The case began to stall for Nicole's family. It was terrifying. Every day without answers reduced the chances of finding her killer. Then in August 2016, everything changed. A notification appeared. The National DNA database had found a match. Detectives immediately opened the file. The name attached to the DNA was George Birch. It wasn't the name they expected. George wasn't Nicole's boyfriend. He wasn't a friend. He wasn't a coworker. As far as anyone knew, he had no connection to Nicole whatsoever. At least not on the surface. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered something interesting. George Birch wasn't from Green Bay. He had moved there from Virginia only months before the murder. People described him as quiet, reserved, the kind of man who rarely attracted attention. But his history told a different story. Years earlier, George had been connected to a serious criminal investigation. Although he didn't spend years behind bars, his name had appeared in law enforcement records before. What fascinated detectives most was how his DNA ended up in the national database. Not because of Nicole's murder, but because of an entirely different crime. After Nicole was killed, George became involved in a hit-and-run crash. According to investigators, he fled the scene, then allegedly set fire to the vehicle involved in an attempt to destroy evidence. When he was arrested, police collected his DNA as part of the standard process. George had no idea that decision would eventually come back to haunt him. Without that arrest, his DNA might never have been linked to Nicole's murder. Now, investigators finally had a name, an address, a new suspect, and most importantly, a direct DNA connection to the crime scene. They prepared to question George Birch, but nobody in that interrogation room realized that George's biggest mistake wasn't his DNA. It was something he carried with him every single day: his cell phone. After seizing George's phone, digital forensic experts began examining the data. At first, nothing stood out. Then they discovered something critical. George had Google location history enabled. That meant his phone had quietly recorded his movements for months. Every location, every timestamp, every route, everything had been stored. Investigators downloaded the data and began reconstructing the night Nicole disappeared. What they found changed the case completely. Around 1 a.m., George's phone appeared near the bars where Nicole had last been seen. That alone was suspicious, but it got worse between approximately 1:35 a.m. and 4 a.m. George's phone remained almost stationary in one location: the area near Nicole's home, the same area where investigators believed the attack began. For more than 2 hours, not a few minutes, not a brief stop, more than 2 hours. Then, at approximately 3:58 a.m., the data showed movement. The phone left the neighborhood. It traveled toward the outskirts of the city, to a remote field, the exact field where Nicole's body would later be discovered. The signal remained there briefly, then moved again, this time toward a highway, the same area where Nicole's cell phone was eventually recovered. When detectives placed the location map in front of George, he realized he was in serious trouble. Because people can lie about memories, they can lie about witnesses, but it's much harder to explain why your phone appears in every critical location connected to a murder. At that moment, George's original story began to collapse. And like many suspects backed into a corner, he decided to tell a new story, a story that he hoped would shift all responsibility onto someone else: Doug Dietrich. When his original story stopped making sense, George Birch quickly changed it. This time, he admitted that he had met Nicole, but according to George, he wasn't the killer. He was simply an unwilling witness. George claimed that he and Nicole met that night. They talked, then went together to an area near her home. But according to his story, everything suddenly changed. Doug appeared out of the darkness holding a gun. George claimed he was knocked unconscious, and when he woke up, Nicole was lying motionless on the ground. George insisted that Doug was responsible, he said. He only followed Doug's orders because he was terrified. At first glance, the story sounded plausible, at least for someone trying to explain why his DNA was found at a murder scene. But investigators had more than a story. They had evidence, and the evidence told a very different story. Forensic experts began reconstructing Nicole's final hours. What they discovered was horrifying. Nicole did not die immediately. She fought. She fought until her very last moments. Her entire body showed signs of a prolonged and brutal attack. In total, investigators documented 241 separate injuries. 241. That wasn't the result of a brief loss of control. It was evidence of an extremely violent assault. Nicole had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object. Her jaw was severely fractured. She suffered extensive injuries to her face and head. Medical examiners concluded that she fought back throughout the attack. Bruises on her arms suggested she repeatedly raised them in self-defense. Several fingernails were broken, and beneath those fingernails, investigators found tiny fragments of skin. DNA testing revealed they all belonged to the same person, George Birch. Not Doug, not someone else. George. Detectives believed Nicole fought so fiercely that she scratched her attacker while trying to escape. And in doing so, she unknowingly left behind one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. The final cause of death was determined to be strangulation. The killer had used a thick cable, the same cable found beside the road. The following morning, the cable carried George's DNA. Everything was beginning to connect. Every clue, every piece of evidence, every forensic finding, all leading to the same man. But George still refused to give up. He continued, insisting that he was innocent. And in the newest version of his story, Doug was still the killer. George believed he had created a lie, convincing enough to generate reasonable doubt. But what he didn't know was that investigators had just uncovered another piece of evidence. Evidence that couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bribed, and couldn't lie. Digital data. By now, George Birch had changed his story multiple times. At first, he claimed he had never met Nicole. Then he admitted meeting her, but insisted Doug was the killer. According to George, he and Nicole willingly left together that night. They went near her home. Then Doug suddenly appeared. George claimed he was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, Nicole was dead, he said. He only helped move her body because Doug threatened him with a gun. If that story were true, it could explain why George's DNA was found at the scene, and it could potentially create reasonable doubt for a jury. But investigators began examining every detail of his account, and cracks quickly appeared. There was no evidence George had ever been knocked unconscious, no medical records, no injuries consistent with his claim. No witnesses ever saw Doug carrying a gun. No physical evidence placed Doug at the crime scene. But the evidence that completely destroyed George's story came from somewhere else, his own cell phone. During their analysis, investigators discovered something revealing. Before his arrest, George had spent a significant amount of time researching Nicole Vanderheyden's case. He read articles about the murder, followed updates on the investigation, studied Nicole's personal life, and paid particular attention to her relationship with Doug. That realization changed everything. George wasn't describing what actually happened. He was using information he had learned from news reports to build a new narrative, a narrative specifically designed to blame someone else. The deeper prosecutors looked, the more convinced they became. George had been studying the case for months. He knew police initially suspected Doug. He knew the couple had argued. He knew Doug had been arrested. And he tried to turn those facts into a believable explanation. The problem was, the evidence didn't support him. Location data placed George at key locations. George's DNA was found at the scene. His skin was discovered beneath Nicole's fingernails. And there was absolutely no physical evidence linking Doug to the murder. Layer by layer, George's story began to fall apart. Excuse after excuse collapsed. By this point, investigators were confident they had found the real killer. But there was still one issue. George had made a serious accusation, he insisted. Doug was present during the murder. If that were true, the entire case would change. Before moving forward to trial, investigators needed to answer one final question. Where was Doug that night? Fortunately, Doug had unknowingly carried a witness with him. An electronic witness, a small device worn on his wrist. And the data inside that device was about to destroy George Birch's final lie, a Fitbit. For decades, homicide investigations relied heavily on witnesses. But in this case, the most important witness wasn't a person. It was a Fitbit. Doug Dutree wore the fitness tracker every day, just like millions of other people. He used it to monitor his steps, heart rate, and daily activity. What Doug never realized was that the device had quietly recorded his movements on the night Nicole was murdered. When George accused Doug of being at the crime scene, prosecutors decided to examine the Fitbit data. If George was telling the truth, the data would prove it. But if George was lying, the Fitbit would know. Digital forensic experts downloaded the information and reconstructed Doug's movements, minute by minute. The results were devastating. According to the Fitbit data, Doug wasn't running. He wasn't involved in a violent struggle. He wasn't traveling to the location where Nicole was attacked. Instead, the device showed him at home, with very limited activity. Nothing consistent with a prolonged assault, but the most important detail wasn't his activity level. It was the timing. George claimed Doug was at the crime scene during the murder. The Fitbit data showed he was somewhere else. Both stories couldn't be true. One of them had to be false, and every piece of evidence pointed to George. For prosecutors, this was the final piece of the puzzle. DNA, location history, skin found beneath Nicole's fingernails, and now Fitbit data. Each piece of evidence had been collected independently, yet all of it led to the same conclusion. George Birch was the only person who appeared throughout the entire story. When the trial began, the defense attempted to challenge some of the evidence, but they faced a major problem. Not one piece of evidence, but many, layer upon layer, each one reinforcing the next. The weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. Jurors listened to days of testimony. They reviewed the cell phone records, examined the forensic evidence, studied the Fitbit data, and ultimately, they reached a verdict. George Birch was guilty. Guilty of kidnapping, guilty of murder, and guilty of attempting to conceal what happened that night. The sentence was handed down. George Birch would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But what makes this case remarkable isn't simply that the killer was caught. It's how he was caught. Because if this crime had happened only a few years earlier, George might have gotten away with it. No eyewitnesses saw the attack. No surveillance cameras captured the crime. No direct witnesses existed. Yet technology accomplished what people could not. A cell phone recorded the killer's movements. A Fitbit proved an innocent man was telling the truth, and together they reconstructed exactly what happened on the night. Nicole Vanderheyden lost her life. A story George Birch desperately tried to bury, but in the end, his own data became the witness against him. The murder of Nicole Vanderheyden is a chilling reminder of how quickly life can change. That night, Nicole simply went out to enjoy a concert with friends. No one imagined it would be the last night of her life. No one imagined that her final steps would lead to a brutal attack in the darkness. And no one imagined that the investigation would nearly end with an innocent man being wrongfully convicted. For weeks, every piece of evidence seemed to point directly at Doug DeTry. But the truth was hidden somewhere else entirely. Hidden inside data that most people never think about. A smartphone, a Fitbit, two devices designed to make everyday life easier. Yet in this case, they became witnesses that could not lie. George Birch believed he had covered his tracks. He tried to erase evidence. He moved the body. He discarded key pieces of evidence. And he even built elaborate stories to place the blame on someone else. But in the end, technology recorded what he could not erase. Every step, every location, every minute, every lie. And when all of those pieces were finally put together, the truth became impossible to deny. Nicole Vanderheyden could never tell investigators what happened to her that night. But the data told the story for her. And those digital traces ensured that the man responsible for her death would never walk free again. What makes this case so extraordinary isn't just the brutality of the crime. It's the fact that justice came from places no one expected. Not from an eyewitness, not from a confession, but from the silent devices we carry with us every day. Devices that remembered everything, even when the killer hoped the world would forget. Thank you for watching. If you found this case fascinating, disturbing, or thought-provoking, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more real criminal cases, where, sometimes, the truth is far more terrifying than fiction.